Hey guys, tonight we step onto a Viking longship, right at the moment the daylight begins to slip away. Yeah, the exact moment you'd probably be texting someone to say, I think I'm lost. Out here, you don't get that luxury. Instead, you get a crew of Vikings staring anxiously at the horizon, like they're waiting for someone to turn the lights back on. And honestly, if you were in their wool shoes, you might not survive your first night, because these folks navigate using the sun, the stars, and a level of collective panic that feels suspiciously familiar to losing Wi-Fi during a Netflix cliffhanger. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, adjust to a comfortable sleeping position, and let's begin our journey tonight in a relaxed and pleasant way. You step forward on the deck, and the planks beneath your boots groan with that long, wooden sigh only old ships know how to make. The salty wind brushes your hair back, and the sky above you stretches wide and impossibly open. A Viking helmsman squints past you, lifting what looks like a chunk of polished crystal. Yes, the famous sunstone. He angles it toward the dimming light, trying to guess where the sun is hiding behind clouds that seem personally offended by anyone wanting clear visibility. To your surprise, the crew watches that crystal like it's a holy relic, or the last battery bar on a road trip. There's actual historical debate about how common sunstones were, and scholars still argue whether Vikings really used them regularly, or whether the whole idea is just one medieval writer being a little too enthusiastic with his descriptions. But tonight, on this ship, the sunstone feels real enough that every Viking here holds their breath. The crystal catches faint light, and the helmsman grunts as though receiving divine revelation. You lean in. He looks like he's pretending to understand something he's absolutely guessing at. An expression you recognize from every group project where someone claims, "Yeah, I totally know what I'm doing." As the last streaks of daylight disappear, the nerves on deck shift. Vikings, for all their axes and bravado, aren't big fans of darkness. They want stars. Bright, friendly ones that behave and stay where they belong. You tilt your head up. The night sky spreads like velvet sprinkled with something between hope and cosmic confetti. A younger sailor begins pointing out constellations, though he confidently IDs one cluster as Thor's feasting bowl, which, you're pretty sure, doesn't exist. But hey, if it comforts him, you're not correcting it. A more seasoned navigator taps your shoulder and gestures toward the North Star, explaining how it anchors their direction. It's one of those simple, elegant facts of history. Vikings relied on Polaris as faithfully as you rely on Google Maps. Of course, academic circles still argue exactly how precise they were. Some say they mastered the stars at an expert level. Others believe their navigation was a mix of skill, luck, and occasional, "Please, Odin, don't let us die." But there's something wonderfully human in that uncertainty. You feel it right now in the shift of the boat, the worried sideways glances of sailors, the way someone tightens his grip on the oar like it's an emotional support paddle. A cold gust sweeps across the deck. You pull your cloak closer. The Vikings do too. And you all pivot your gazes back up, because without stars, this ship might as well be drifting inside a metaphorical shrug. The clouds remind you of that one friend who blocks your view of the concert stage despite being fully aware of their height advantage. No one blames them, but everyone quietly resents them. A sailor presses a wooden board into your hands, a primitive sun compass, though he taps it proudly like he's giving you the latest tech upgrade. The idea that Vikings used this instrument is a real historical theory, involving shadows and angles and way more math than anyone on this deck appears prepared to do in the dark. You study the markings, trying to look impressed rather than confused. A few sailors whisper behind you. They assume you're a genius for understanding it. A gentle reminder: never correct someone who thinks you're smarter than you are. The ship dips on a wave, and the crew instinctively steadies themselves. You do too, because despite the jokes and the easy tone of the night, the North Atlantic is not playing games. Out here, weather is king. The Vikings know this deeply, respect it almost spiritually. They can handle storms, cold, even enemies, but low visibility, that's the real boss level. You can sense their anxiety gathering quietly like fog in a horror movie you're allowed to laugh at but not rewrite. Someone mutters that the sky feels strange tonight. Another replies that every sky feels strange when you're too far from home. A third adds that strange skies make strange decisions. Historically speaking, Vikings often chose to anchor and wait out nights with poor visibility, not because they feared the sea, but because they respected it. Though, if you ask the crew directly, they'll say it's because navigating blind is how you end up in Iceland when you wanted England. And given the reputations of both places at the time, that was a pretty big mix-up. But even through their nerves, you see something impressive: teamwork. A couple sailors adjust the sail, another sharpens the prow lantern wick, and a few start singing quietly. Not rowdy drinking songs, but soft, rhythmic ones meant to keep everyone calm. One of them explains that songs help them measure time and direction. It's the kind of knowledge that doesn't show up in most history books, but it's a jewel of oral tradition. Scholars still discuss how much musical cadence influenced Viking navigation techniques, since the written sources are vague, poetic, and occasionally contradict each other like siblings arguing over who stole the last piece of bread. You inhale deeply, taking in the combined scent of pine tar, salt, wool, and the lingering awkwardness of a crew pretending they're not afraid of the dark. It's strangely comforting, because in your own way, you understand them. Humans, no matter the century, share the same quiet anxieties when the lights go out. A break in the clouds reveals a glitter of stars, and the ship exhales collectively. The helmsman adjusts the rudder. The sail billows just right, and slowly, confidently, you feel the vessel realign with the correct course. Not because the Vikings are fearless, but because they persist even when they're scared. You settle onto a coil of rope, the night rocking around you gently, and a soft calm spreads over the deck. The stars guide you forward, and for the first time tonight, you feel steady. You step off the longship with a crunch of wet sand under your boots, and the Vikings spill onto the shore around you like a group of campers who wildly overestimated their ability to rough it. They march inland with confidence, at least for the first 15 seconds, until the shadows of the forest stretch toward them like long, quiet fingers. That's when you notice it. A subtle tightening of shoulders, a few exchanged glances, and one guy who suddenly becomes very committed to standing near the brightest torch. The plan tonight is simple: make camp, stay warm, and absolutely avoid thinking about how fast the darkness settles in these northern latitudes. And trust me, you think you get anxious when streetlights flicker? Vikings look at the night like it's an unpaid debt that might suddenly show up to collect. They pick a clearing just beyond the tree line, and instantly the place blooms into controlled chaos. You watch one man dump an entire armful of firewood onto a single burning log, as if volume directly translates into bravery. Another Viking runs back and forth from the woods, carrying twigs so small they might as well be props in a school play about forest ecosystems. He tosses them onto the flames with ceremony, like each tiny branch is a heroic offering. Historically, Vikings did rely heavily on fire, not just for warmth, but for psychological comfort. Nighttime was intimidating, and in a world without streetlights, LED lamps, or phone flashlights, fire was safety. Archaeologists have even found remnants of campfire pits positioned intentionally to cast the widest possible radius of light, kind of like the medieval version of turning on every lamp in your house before watching a scary movie. But tonight, this particular crew is taking it to extremes. They're building not one campfire, but 5. You stand in the middle of the clearing, watching fire after fire blaze to life until the whole campsite glows like a small festival that absolutely no one meant to organize. A Viking with impressive beard volume, let's call him Bjorn because there's an 80% chance you guessed correctly, offers you a bundle of sticks. You contribute your share to the nearest pit, and he nods appreciatively as if you've just passed some kind of initiation. He explains that the brighter the fires, the less likely things from the woods will come close. He says it casually, but his voice dips at the end, like someone remembering that darkness is, in fact, not negotiable. The things from the woods part is vague, and honestly a little comedic, because he defines them with a hand gesture so nonspecific it could mean wolves, spirits, squirrels, or his mother-in-law. Historical accounts do show that Vikings had plenty of wildlife to worry about, including bears and wolves. But they also had folklore, lots of it, and the line between real animals and night creatures blurred just enough to make everyone uneasy. Historians still debate which fears were practical and which were cultural. Sources mix hard facts with poetic metaphors like they were seasoning a stew. As the fires strengthen, the Vikings begin to unload gear, creating makeshift shelters using wool blankets, shields, spare planks, and a level of optimism that feels deeply unrealistic. You help one of them hammer stakes into the ground, only to watch him reposition the shelter 3 times, because the fire isn't bright enough from that angle. This is the exact energy of someone rearranging furniture at 2 a.m. to improve the vibe. Then comes the real entertainment, the wood-gathering sprints. Every few minutes, someone notices the fires dimming by a fraction, and a small panic ripple spreads through camp. Suddenly, 3 Vikings grab axes and run for the tree line like contestants in a reality show, where the goal is, don't let the flame die or we all emotionally collapse. You try joining them once, stepping into the forest where the darkness hugs everything too tightly. Behind you, the campfire light fades, and ahead, the trees swallow sound in that hush that makes your skin alert itself. Vikings believed the forest at night held spirits, sometimes protective, sometimes mischievous. According to one saga, nightfall awakened ancient beings who disliked being disturbed. Scholars still argue whether these tales were literal beliefs or bedtime stories with excellent PR longevity. But either way, you don't feel inspired to linger. You return to the clearing with an armful of branches, earning a grateful clap on the back from an older sailor who smells strongly of smoke and determination. The fires flare again, and you swear the collective exhale is almost melodic. Once the immediate fire crisis stabilizes, the Vikings finally start to relax. Some sit near you, stretching out their legs, boots steaming as they dry. Others adjust the logs like amateur fire control technicians. One man pokes the flames too enthusiastically, and sparks leap out, earning him a full camp's worth of judgmental stares. You take a seat near the largest pit, and the warmth embraces your hands. A Viking beside you admits, in a voice low enough to seem brave adjacent, that he hates how quiet nights are. He says it feels like the world is holding its breath. Historically, Vikings valued noise, songs, stories, the movement of people, because silence felt unnatural. With farms, animals, and children, their homes were rarely quiet, so the stillness of unfamiliar coastline nights amplified every fear. A younger Viking sits cross-legged and starts carving a piece of wood, not into anything recognizable yet, but he insists it helps him stop thinking about shadows. Another jokes that the younger one carves badly enough to scare the shadows themselves. The laughter that follows is gentle, and you realize humor is their coping mechanism. Even sagas are filled with moments of comic relief, because survival isn't just about strength, it's about morale. A few men start placing extra logs at strategic points around the camp, trying to extend the glow as far as possible. One Viking begins arranging stones around a fire pit in a pattern he claims is traditional. Another Viking leans toward you and whispers that his friend just likes making symmetrical things because it calms him down. The academic debate over Viking ritual versus personal habit continues right there in front of the flames, and you find it charming that even the experts today still aren't sure which behaviors were cultural norms and which were just individual quirks. The fires crackle on, louder now, fuller, warmer. The clearing glows so brightly you could probably read a book out here, assuming you had one that wasn't written on a fragile manuscript back home. A few men lie on their backs and stare upward, grateful for fire-lit safety, while others sharpen tools or mend sails, pretending they're unbothered by the advancing night. But you can see it clearly now. Vikings weren't fearless warriors shrugging at the dark. They were humans who respected the night, feared it a little, and did everything in their power to stay comfortable until morning. And in this soft ring of firelight, with sparks drifting into the air like tiny fireflies, you feel that mixture of courage and vulnerability settle around you like an old, familiar blanket. You wake to the smell of damp grass, warm embers, and Vikings arguing about whose turn it is to fetch water. An argument that sounds suspiciously like the modern "who forgot to do the dishes" debate. Dawn hasn't fully broken yet, but the sky already carries that pale northern glow that tells you it's time to move. And as you push yourself up from your bedroll, you catch the first real glimpse of something important. These so-called eternal warriors look tired, stiff, slightly grumpy. Basically, like people who slept on uneven ground and now regret all life choices up to this moment. This morning, you're about to discover that Vikings didn't spend every day swinging axes and raiding foreign shores like action movie protagonists. In fact, you might be the only one here who still believes that stereotype because the crew's priority right now is fixing gear, cooking porridge, and figuring out who stepped on the dried fish supply. It's a whole domestic drama. And honestly, it's kind of adorable. As you help a few sailors fold their wool blankets, one of them pats you on the shoulder and says something roughly equivalent to, "Welcome to farm life on a boat." He's joking, but not by much. Historically, Vikings were farmers first and warriors second. They raised livestock, planted barley, maintained tools, built fences, and argued over grazing rights, sometimes more fiercely than they fought rivals abroad. Most of the year, they were working the land, not pillaging it. Scholars even argue that farming shaped Viking society more than raiding did, though sagas tend to gloss over that because, "and then we harvested oats," doesn't exactly make for heroic literature. But today, you're seeing that truth firsthand. Breakfast becomes a team effort involving porridge so thick you could probably patch a roof with it. Two men debate whether to add dried berries, and a third insists that berries are for the weak. Another Viking rolls his eyes so dramatically you nearly applaud. Someone hands you a wooden bowl, steaming and a little lumpy. The heat feels good in your cold hands, and as you eat, you notice a few sailors repairing ropes nearby. One carefully coils the fibers like he's grooming a pet snake. Another, younger and more impulsive, keeps trying to tie experimental knots just to see if he can invent a new one. A nearby elder swats him on the back of the head every time a rope snarls. The tasks pile up quickly, cleaning tar, checking the keel, inspecting oars, sorting trade goods, mending clothing. A group off to your left is repairing a tear in the sail, and one Viking cheerfully claims he stitched so much last year he could probably open a clothing workshop in another life. Another grumbles that his spouse already expects that from him. Domestic banter, ancient edition. Then comes the strangest part, the farming talk. While sharpening a blade, a burly Viking casually asks you how your goats back home are doing. When you tell him, truthfully, that you don't have goats, he stares at you with deep pity, as though you've revealed a tragic flaw in your character. Another sailor boasts proudly about the yield from his family's fields, explaining that he's only on this voyage to earn metal tools and maybe some fine cloth to impress his neighbors. The way he talks about barley, you'd think it was gold. You begin to realize something humorous. If you dropped this group into a modern American suburb, they'd blend right in during any early morning farmers market conversation. Raiding isn't their default vocabulary, but soil, pasture, and weather patterns? They could lecture you all day, and they do. One of them launches into a detailed explanation of how to rotate crops to avoid soil exhaustion. Another talks about efficient hay storage. Yet another insists cows have distinct personalities, a statement that sparks a passionate debate that lasts 10 minutes and involves multiple examples, 2 impressions, and one dramatic reenactment of a cow refusing to move. Even better, the academic world still debates how much of Viking warfare was planned military strategy versus seasonal necessity. Some historians argue raids were rare but sensationalized. Others believe raiding was a consistent, structured part of their economy. You glance around the morning chore list unfolding in front of you and think, yeah, probably seasonal. After breakfast, the crew begins preparing for the day's work. Not a fight, not a raid, but a long session of repairing, organizing, and tending. You join a group collecting driftwood to patch parts of the railing. Another group goes to fetch water, carefully inspecting streams for anything suspicious. A third group cleans fish nets with the seriousness of surgeons. Nothing about this resembles the glamorous warrior lifestyle movies like to portray. Instead, it feels more like a camping trip with a particularly intense scout troop. You take a moment to watch the rhythm of the camp. Firewood chopped in steady intervals, nets stretched and inspected, tools measured and tested, boots dried near the flames, cloaks brushed to remove yesterday's mud. Someone teaches a teenager how to sharpen an axe without grinding it down too fast. Historically accurate advice, since metal was expensive and axes weren't disposable props. There's a quiet beauty in the routine, even calming. You start to understand that Viking strength didn't just come from swinging weapons, it came from this: their ability to sustain themselves, adapt, repair, build, reorganize, and repeat. The unromantic stuff, the ordinary stuff, the real stuff. One Viking laughs when you ask if today includes a raid. Raid? No, not unless a raccoon steals our food, he says, pointing at a creature rummaging near the tree line. Everyone collectively chases it, yelling things that sound heroic but really just mean shoo. The raccoon looks unimpressed. You settle onto a fallen log and watch as the morning settles into its rhythm. You feel the calm of the day move through the camp like a slow tide, washing away the anxieties of last night. These people aren't living legends. They're workers, parents, neighbors, community members. Their stories were written with farms as often as with swords. And maybe that's even more impressive, because the truth is, legends exaggerate, but daily life doesn't. And this small, busy, slightly chaotic camp feels far more human than any saga ever dared to admit. You step forward just in time to see a Viking navigator lift a polished crystal, yes, the sunstone, up to the fading glow. He tilts it back and forth, squinting like he's trying to coax the last drop of sunlight from the sky. The crew watches him with the same energy as passengers watching a pilot press a lot of buttons and hoping that means something good. Historically, sunstones are a fascinating mystery. Icelandic sagas mention them. Medieval writers describe them. Archaeologists keep debating them. And scholars are still arguing whether Vikings actually use them daily, or whether the story is just history's version of an overhyped product review. But tonight, on this boat, the sunstone is treated with near religious reverence. The navigator nods gravely at the crystal's faint shimmer. You lean in, trying to understand what he's reading. Honestly, it looks like he's inventing confidence on the spot. The last streak of light disappears. A ripple of discomfort spreads through the deck. You feel it immediately, the subtle shift from, "We've got this," to, "Are the stars out yet? Please be out." Vikings were incredible navigators, but they weren't reckless. They relied on a delicate relationship with the environment, and night tested that relationship more than anything else. A sailor gestures upward. The sky, huge, black, endless, slowly reveals the first stars. You instinctively lift your chin, and the sheer blue-black canvas above you feels almost theatrical. A young Viking points excitedly at a bright cluster and calls it Odin's lantern, which is not a constellation any astronomer has ever confirmed. But you let the moment slide. He looks so proud. A more experienced navigator stands beside you and traces an invisible line from Polaris downward. His explanation is wonderfully simple. Keep the North Star steady, and your ship stays steady. That's your historical knowledge point for the night. Vikings really did rely heavily on Polaris. They even built directional systems around it. But the academic world still debates how exact their methods were. Some say the Vikings achieved near-perfect precision. Others insist it was more educated guess with good instincts. You're still processing this when clouds drift in like uninvited guests at a party. The stars blur, vanish, reappear, vanish again. The crew shifts restlessly. You tighten your cloak because suddenly the air feels heavier, the night darker. Low visibility is the Vikings' least favorite setting, and you can practically hear their collective internal monologue. Not again. A sailor hands you a wooden sun compass, its surface carved with runes and shallow grooves. He explains how shadows during the day help them determine direction. At night, though, the tool becomes more symbolic than functional, something to hold on to when faith runs ahead of certainty. Scholars still argue how often Vikings use these compasses, but this sailor seems convinced it's essential, even if it's currently doing absolutely nothing. You feel the ship list gently on a wave, and your hand instinctively grabs a rope. The ocean murmurs beneath you, dark and cold and impossibly vast. The Vikings seem to feel the same thing, respect, maybe even awe. Out here, the sea is the real authority. And when it's night, that authority is strict. A man nearby mutters that the wind sounds odd. Another squints into the darkness as if expecting the weather to answer him. Historically, Vikings had an almost supernatural sensitivity to wind shifts, temperature changes, and ocean patterns. Their survival depended on it. They watched the sea the way modern people check weather apps, obsessively, constantly, sometimes dramatically. One Viking, tall and serious, grips the side of the ship. "If we lose the sky," he murmurs, "we lose our way." You realize this isn't fear, it's realism. Without stars, they could drift hundreds of miles off course. There's a saga about a ship that intended to reach Ireland and somehow ended up in Iceland instead, a mistake the crew described as unexpected but acceptable. The academic community still debates whether this was an accident or an intentional settlement voyage. You look at the clouded sky and think, yeah, I can guess. The clouds part for a moment, and the crew exhales together. You've never heard relief sound more synchronized. The North Star glints through a gap like a small but firm promise. The helmsman adjusts the steering board. The sail flutters, then steadies. You can feel the ship realigning beneath your feet, like a heartbeat calming down. Someone begins humming a low, rhythmic tune. Others join in, voices weaving together in soft harmony. Vikings used songs to keep time, to regulate rowing, even to maintain mental focus during navigation. Some historians even propose that rhythmic chanting helped them estimate distance, not scientifically, but intuitively. Whether or not that theory is perfect, the effect tonight is soothing. The notes seem to anchor everyone, including you. As the stars return in full, the night transforms. It's no longer the terrifying unknown. It's a quiet guide, a map written in light. The sailor's shoulders drop. Conversations pick up again. Someone jokes about how earlier he mistook a cloud for a sea monster, and another Viking teases him so loudly, you're pretty sure the ocean itself heard it. You lean back against a mast, letting the rhythm of the ship rock you. The waves are gentle. The crew is calmer. The sky, finally clear, shines brilliantly above you. It's almost peaceful. And in that peacefulness, you realize something important. Vikings weren't fearless because they lacked fear. They were fearless because they faced fear every day. The sea, the sky, the darkness, and kept going anyway. Tonight, they navigate by stars. And you, wrapped in the soft hush of the longship, drift with them into deeper water, quietly trusting the sky to lead the way. You sit close to the fire because the Vikings sure are. They practically press themselves into the warmth like they're trying to fuse emotionally with the flames. The wind nudges branches in the forest, and every Viking stiffens simultaneously. You've never seen grown adults, and muscular ones at that, freeze this fast without a coach blowing a whistle. A few men shift closer together until their shoulders touch. One whispers something about a Huldufolk sighting, hidden folk from Icelandic folklore. Another swears he heard a troll's footsteps earlier. You look at the forest, listening, and realize you're not entirely convinced they're joking. Historically, Vikings genuinely believed that the night was full of beings. Trolls, Draugr, Huldufolk, giants, forest spirits, restless ancestors, and a few mythological creatures that honestly sound like someone combined wolves, shadows, and sleep paralysis. These stories weren't just entertainment. They helped explain the unpredictable world around them. Thunderstorms, Thor's traveling, strange noises in the woods, forest spirits, missing livestock, troll attacks apparently. One sailor pokes the fire anxiously, making sparks jump out like tiny fireworks. You ask him what worries him most at night. He doesn't even blink. The creatures that come when people stop paying attention. You nod, pretending that is a completely normal sentence and definitely not a reason to climb a tree. Another Viking shares a more scholarly perspective. Well, as scholarly as a man with soot on his nose can be. He says trolls avoid fire, ghosts avoid iron, and mischievous spirits avoid people who sing loudly and badly enough. Then he points at a man named Eirik and declares him the camp's best protection. Eirik flexes proudly, though you're not sure the compliment landed the way it was intended. You shift your attention to a younger sailor who's carving a small wooden charm. He explains that his grandmother taught him it keeps nightmares away. You admire it. Simple, delicate, shaped like a tiny hammer. A nod to Thor, and your cold little heart warms a bit. Here's your historical fact of the night. Many Viking Age amulets have been found shaped like Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. People wore them for protection from harm, storms, enemies, and yes, nighttime terrors. But scholars still debate whether they were primarily religious symbols or simply cultural charms. You look around the circle of grown men subtly touching their necklaces, and you think, maybe both. A sudden snap of a twig in the woods jolts everyone upright. Shields shift, axes tighten in hands. One guy gasps softly in a way he will absolutely deny tomorrow. After a long pause, a fox trots out of the trees, stops, looks at everyone like they're ridiculous, and leaves. The entire camp exhales. One Viking mumbles that the fox was definitely a shapeshifter, and honestly, no one disagrees. The fire crackles louder as someone adds more logs, extra insurance against imaginary monsters. Vikings sit with their backs to the flames, staring outward into the darkness like lifeguards on duty. It's oddly wholesome. Their fear doesn't make them weaker. It makes them watchful, united. You notice a man drawing a protective rune in the dirt, an algiz symbol shaped like a little upward fork. He explains softly that it keeps harmful spirits away. Another Viking adds a second rune beside it, just in case. A third adds a third. Before long, the entire circle around the fire looks like a magical doodle session. Someone else begins telling a story. His voice is low, steady, almost melodic. He describes a troll that lives under a cliff, tall as a pine tree with arms like fallen logs. Though he insists that this troll isn't dangerous unless you're rude or smell like overripe fish. You wonder if this is a moral tale or just very passive-aggressive hygiene criticism. The camp listens intently. The fire flickers. Shadows dance. Even the wind seems to lean in. Viking storytelling served many purposes: entertainment, memory keeping, emotional bonding, and yes, keeping fear at manageable levels. Scholars still argue about how much of the storytelling tradition was ritual and how much was improvisation around the campfire. Based on the storyteller's dramatic hand gestures, you're guessing improvisation had a pretty strong presence. The story ends, and laughter breaks out, soft but real. The tension eases, like steam lifting off hot bread. One Viking nudges you and says, "See? Night isn't so bad, as long as we stay together." You glance at the fires, now blazing brighter than ever, and think they're probably right. Fear, when shared, becomes less sharp, more manageable. Another twig snaps in the woods. Every Viking jumps again. You sigh. Being brave, it seems, is something these warriors have to practice the same way they practice everything else. You pull your cloak tighter, listen to the crackling fire, and let the night settle around you, full of stories, shadows, and the quiet truth that even legends get spooked after dark. You're leaning against the side of the longship as the night breeze brushes past you. Cold, wide, honest in a way the day never is. The stars above scatter like someone tossed a handful of diamonds across velvet, and the water keeps rhythm beneath the hull. Around you, the Vikings settle into their quiet nighttime routines, each man carving out a piece of stillness in the dark. And then you hear it, a soft sigh from somewhere near the bow, not dramatic, not theatrical, just the kind of exhale someone makes when their mind drifts homeward. You shuffle closer, trying not to make your boots creak too loudly, and find a young sailor looking out over the waves. His jaw is strong, his shoulders broad, but in the dim lantern glow he looks small, human in a way that legends usually forget to mention. He doesn't notice you at first. He's too caught up in whatever memory is tugging at him across hundreds of miles of open sea. When he finally speaks, it's almost a whisper. "My mother sings at this hour," he says. "She thinks no one hears her." And there it is, the real heart of tonight. The truth that Vikings, those towering figures history paints like unstoppable storm fronts, got homesick. Badly, regularly, desperately sometimes. Historical records actually mention this more than you'd expect. Travelers wrote about sailors missing their farms, their families, the warmth of home hearths, even the smell of their own sheep. Yes, really. But sagas rarely highlight it, because the hero cried on the deck because he missed his mom doesn't look great carved into stone. Still, archaeologists and scholars discuss this emotional side often, and there's ongoing debate about how mental well-being shaped voyages, especially long ones. You settle beside him, and a few others join, not to intrude, but to share the quiet. One man pulls out a worn wooden comb and carefully fixes his hair. Another starts mending a glove he's already repaired 3 times. These aren't the actions of men eager for glory. They're the tiny rituals of people holding on to pieces of home so they don't drift too far from themselves. A sailor across the deck hums a lullaby under his breath. Not a grand warrior chant, just a simple tune. Something soft, circular, repetitive. Something meant for children fighting sleep or adults fighting loneliness. You feel the melody drift across the ship like warm breath on cold glass. A few Vikings lean closer to listen. Someone wipes at his eyes but pretends it's just the wind. You catch a glimpse of a small carved figure tucked into one man's belt. A wooden horse, smooth from years of being held. His daughter made it, he tells you proudly. She's learning to carve like him. He says he brings the figure on every voyage because it reminds him why he sails. Not for violence or riches, but for trade, for opportunity, for a chance to bring back something better to his family. It's a side of Viking life that often gets overshadowed by the dramatic bits, but most Norsemen weren't chasing glory. They were chasing stability. Someone else mentions that he misses the smell of his family's home, the baking bread, the smoke from their hearth, even the damp earth after rain. You realize that homesickness isn't dramatic out here. It's casual, constant, woven into every conversation like a thread pulling tight. Here's your unusual fact of the night. Some Viking burials actually contain stones or dirt from the deceased's homeland. It was a way of bringing a piece of home into the afterlife, a quiet reminder that even warriors wanted the comfort of familiar ground. Scholars are still debating whether this was symbolic, religious, or simply emotional instinct. But whatever the reason, it speaks volumes about what these people valued. As you sit with the crew, the ship rocks gently, the sea humming its soft and ancient lullaby. A man beside you rubs a wool sleeve across his eyes and grumbles that he's just tired, and everyone politely agrees to pretend that's true. No one laughs, no one teases. Viking culture valued emotional restraint, but it also valued community. Homesickness wasn't mocked, it was understood. Another Viking, older, grayer, steadier, tells a short story about his farm, about a stubborn goat that refuses to stay in its pen, and a wife who teases him that the goat listens better than he does. The whole group chuckles, the sound warm, tender around the edges. You can almost see his farm in your mind. The slopes, the soil, the small house with smoke curling from its roof. It's almost comforting enough to make you homesick too, even if you weren't homesick to begin with. The night deepens. The stars wheel slowly above you. And for a moment, every Viking on this deck becomes the same person, a traveler far from home, holding memories like tiny lights inside them, trying to keep those lights from blowing out in the sea wind. You breathe in the cold air. You exhale something softer. You recognize that homesickness is not weakness here. It's proof of love. And the more you watch these men stare quietly into the night, the more you realize that legends forgot one of the most human truths of all. Even warriors miss home. Even explorers miss their mothers. Even the fierce get lonely under unfamiliar skies. You draw your cloak around your shoulders and settle in beside them as the ship drifts onward, carrying not just men, but every home they ache for. The dawn arrives slowly, as if unsure whether it should pull back the night or let the Vikings sleep a little longer. The horizon blushes first, soft pink, faint gold, before the sun finally stretches itself over the rim of the world. You feel the long ship come alive beneath your feet. Wood warming, ropes creaking, sails stirring, like the breath of some ancient creature waking from dreams. By the time the crew gathers, the light is sharpened, and with it comes a subtle shift in everyone's mood. Last night's softness, those whispered stories and quiet confessions, doesn't vanish, but it settles deeper, forming a quiet foundation beneath the day's work. Vikings didn't indulge in vulnerability for long. They acknowledged it, tucked it away, and then faced whatever waited next on the water. And today, what waits is fog. A white wall of it stretches ahead, thick, dense, unmoving. It clings to the sea like a creature guarding the path. Someone mutters an old Norse saying, "The fog is where the world hides its secrets." Another swears he once heard his uncle talk about fog spirits that whisper warnings to sailors who listen closely, and curses to those who don't. The older men brush off the superstition with a huff, but even they can't quite hide their unease. Fog is dangerous. Every shadow becomes a phantom ship, every sound a possible threat, every shift of water something with teeth. The helmsman grips the steering oar tighter than usual, and the lookout at the bow blinks like he's trying to pierce through milk. As the ship glides into the fog, the world changes. The sea loses its horizon. The sky disappears. The longship becomes a floating island in a universe made of pale nothing. The only sounds are the oars dipping into the water and the occasional splash of something unseen beneath the surface. You feel the crew subtly draw closer together. No one says it, but everyone feels it. Fog strips away distance, pride, and bravado. It leaves only instinct, trust, and the need to stay near the people who make the world feel solid. A tall warrior named Brander nudges you gently. "Listen," he whispers. You do. At first there's nothing but the muffled hush of waves, but then, barely audible, you hear something else. A song, a hum, a kind of thin, vibrating note floating across the fog like a thread of music spun by invisible hands. No one can tell where it's coming from. The sound seems to drift and circle, rising and falling, sometimes near, sometimes far. One man swears it's a woman's voice. Another insists it's the groan of sea ice. A third mutters a single word under his breath. Huldefolk. The hidden people. You look around, but all you see are pale walls of cloud, shifting slowly like breath on a cold morning. Here's your history note. Norse culture had countless stories of beings who lived just beyond the reach of ordinary sight. Spirits, elves, guardians, or tricksters. Fog was one of their favorite hiding places, and sailors often left small offerings. Fish, bread, even bits of metal, whenever they felt the veil between worlds might be thin. Skeptics say it was just a way to ease fear. Believers say the offerings worked because the hidden folk allowed them to pass safely. Today, no one mocks the superstition, not even the stoic warriors. Brander reaches into his pouch and tosses a small carved bead into the water. Others follow, each man offering something simple but personal: a copper coin, a fishbone pendant, a carved rune. The items hit the sea with small plinks that somehow sound louder in the fog. For a moment, the humming fades. Then it comes back, clearer this time, almost melodic, almost welcoming. The helmsman murmurs, "They're letting us through." Whether you believe him or not, the entire ship relaxes a fraction. Shoulders loosen, hands ease off weapons. Even the fog seems to thin, revealing faint hints of blue sky above, like a curtain slowly lifting. But the fog isn't done yet. Just as the ship slips through the final stretch, a shape appears on your left, a dark silhouette half hidden in the mist. Every Viking on board freezes. Oars stop mid-stroke. Hearts stutter in unison. It's another ship. Long, narrow, silent. No ripple of oars. No voices. No flags. Just a dark outline drifting beside you, matching your speed, though you can't see a single crew member on its deck. Your throat tightens. The Vikings' hands hover near their axes, but don't quite grasp them fully. Everyone is waiting for the shape to clarify, for the fog to reveal whether it holds friend, foe, or something older. But just when the hull edges into clearer focus, the ship dissolves back into the mist, as if it had never been there at all. The longship erupts in a mix of muttered prayers, curses, and breathless silence. One of the older warriors, Bjarki, finally speaks. "Seen that once before," he says quietly. "Spirit ship, always traveling, never landing." Brander elbows him. "You're scaring the new traveler." Bjarki shrugs. Maybe the traveler should be scared. And yet, deep down, you're not. The fog feels less threatening now, more like an old storyteller showing you the edges of forgotten worlds. When at last the longship bursts into full sunlight, the crew exhales in a single wave, laughter and relief mixing in the bright morning air. They slap each other's backs. They boast about how calm they were. They pretend no one's hands were shaking. But you know better. Fog changes people. Fog reveals who's brave. Fog reveals who listens. Fog reveals who's human enough to be scared. And the Vikings? They walk out of it stronger, bonded not by glory, but by the shared memory of silence, superstition, and the mysterious ship that sailed beside them for a heartbeat. Ahead, the sea stretches wide and visible again, blue as steel, steady as breath. The journey continues. Morning settles over the longship in a gentle gold that makes everything, from the oars to the seawater clinging to the rail, look a little warmer, a little friendlier, and a whole lot less haunted than last night's fog. The crew stretches, yawns, and immediately begins acting like they never got spooked in the first place. One guy even claims he only threw that protective charm into the water because it was ugly anyway, and you try not to laugh out loud. By the time the sun lifts well above the horizon, the Vikings shift into their daytime rhythm. And today, that rhythm isn't battle preparation, but business. Merchant business. The kind that involves haggling, trading, counting, recounted counting, and insisting that your goods are basically worth their weight in Thor's personal approval. The shoreline ahead belongs to a small trading outpost. Nothing dramatic, just a cluster of wooden buildings leaning into the wind like tired villagers listening to gossip. Smoke rises from cooking fires. A few dogs bark. And you realize something surprising. The Vikings relax instantly, like office workers stepping into a familiar coffee shop. Turns out, raiding was the dramatic thing they occasionally did, but trading was the thing that kept their families fed, their communities stable, and their chiefs from constantly asking awkward questions like, "So, any income this month?" As the ship glides toward the dock, you spot all kinds of goods piled between the oarsmen's feet: furs, carved combs, amber beads, iron tools, and enough dried fish to stock a medieval Costco. In return, they're hoping to pick up grain, wine, silk, pottery, basically anything that makes life feel slightly less like being trapped in a wet wool armpit. The first thing you notice once your feet hit the dock is how normal the place feels. No guards rushing out, no villagers hiding their children, just merchants who look you over with the same expression you'd give someone walking into your garage sale and asking if that broken lamp is antique. And instead of swinging axes, the Vikings immediately start doing something far more terrifying. They negotiate. A burly merchant approaches the crew and holds up a bolt of bright blue cloth. Finest dye in the region, he claims, worth 3 combs. One of the Vikings, Arna, tilts his head and replies, 2 combs, and a story so good you'll feel wiser just hearing it. 4 combs, the merchant counters, not even acknowledging the story bribe. And this continues for several minutes. 2 people with arms the size of tree trunks politely arguing about combs, cloth, and existential worth. It's almost charming. You half expect someone to pull out a little chalkboard labeled Specials of the Day. Here's your main history nugget. Vikings operated vast trading networks that reached from the North Atlantic to the Middle East. They traded furs to Byzantium, bought silk from Persia, and sold walrus ivory to pretty much anyone who thought it looked fancy enough to display at dinner. The global shopping mall didn't appear overnight. It grew through steady, everyday exchanges just like this. You wander along the market row, listening as Vikings try to convince merchants that their fish isn't that dried, or that their amber has magical properties studied by scholars. A claim the scholarly world would definitely argue about today. Some researchers say amber held symbolic meaning. Others say it was just shiny, and people like shiny things. The debate is still alive and well, often discussed by folks who have never personally held a chunk of amber, but feel spiritually connected to the topic. The funniest part? The Vikings aren't just good at trading, they enjoy it. 2 warriors, people you've seen row through storms and glare down imaginary threats in the fog, are now loudly arguing about the price of a ceramic bowl in a way that can only be described as deeply domestic. One points out that the glaze is chipped. The other claims the chip gives it character. The potter looks like he wants to lie down. And then you meet the oddball of the group, Snorri. Snorri doesn't trade with goods. Snorri trades with, brace yourself, reputation. He stands dramatically in the middle of the market calling out, "Who wants the honor of selling me their finest wares? Think of the story you can tell later." A merchant blinks at him slowly. "Is that a form of currency?" "In my village," Snorri replies, "this face is worth at least 3 jars of honey." You don't know what's funnier, the absolute confidence or the fact that he almost succeeds. As you drift deeper into the market, something else becomes clear. This isn't just a place for buying things. It's a place for catching up on news, building relationships, and quietly assessing who might be an ally or rival next season. Trade is the social fabric that holds the Viking world together. They might bring axes on voyages, but they bring gossip to the marketplace, and that might be an even sharper tool. You pass a stall where 2 old sailors are arguing about the best route to sail next summer. One insists the southern path is safer. The other swears that a sea monster lives there, but it's mostly friendly if you bring fish. The scholars back home would definitely debate that one too, though probably with fewer fish involved and more footnotes. Then there's the cold, strange little fact you didn't expect to learn today. Vikings sometimes traded soap, and not the nice lavender-scented kind you'd use to unwind. More like functional brick that probably exfoliates your soul. Still, their version was so effective that locals in the British Isles complained the Vikings looked annoyingly clean and attractive, which is honestly not what pop culture led you to expect. by the time midday sun bounces off the water, the longship is heavier with goods and lighter with fish, an excellent trade by Viking standards. Arnie finally gets his blue cloth. Snorri manages to convince someone to give him honey after all. And you're holding a tiny carved bead someone gifted you for luck, though you're not sure if that means good luck or please don't come back and ruin my inventory. As you step back onto the ship, the merchants wave casually, already turning to greet the next travelers. No shouting, no panic, just business as usual, because in this world, Vikings aren't invaders, they're customers. And honestly, they're pretty good ones. The sail rises, the ropes tighten. The ship pulls away, loaded with stories and supplies, leaving behind a market that will remember them not as raiders, but as regulars. The ocean opens again in front of you, shimmering like an invitation. By the time the ship settles back into its rhythm on the open water, the air has shifted again. Quieter, calmer, carrying a kind of early evening softness that feels like the world is exhaling after a long day. The crew lounges around the deck with the easy comfort of people who know there's nothing urgent to do until the next shoreline appears. But as the sun dips lower, casting long golden streaks across the waves, something else begins stirring on board. It starts with a single voice. Old Bjarki, the man who talks like he was carved from an oak tree. He's sitting cross-legged near the mast, running his fingers along a small wooden figure, smoothing its edges as if coaxing the story out of it. You drift closer without meaning to. Everyone does. Story time isn't a scheduled event among Vikings. It simply happens. And when it does, people gather like moths to a lantern. The voices around you lower, oars rest. The ship drifts in the gentle swell, and Bjarki begins. Here's the thing about Viking storytelling. You might expect loud, dramatic, chest-thumping sagas told with enough enthusiasm to knock seagulls out of the sky. And yes, those exist. But the everyday stories, the ones shared by sailors who miss home, who fear the dark, who want to make their world feel a little less unpredictable, those stories are softer, warmer, more human than legend. Bjarki's voice is low and steady, carrying over the deck like a night breeze. He speaks of Odin wandering the world in disguise, of Thor pretending he wasn't scared of giants even when he absolutely was, of Freya whose tears became drops of amber. And that, he says, tapping the bead at his belt, is why amber protects us on the sea. A young crew member asks if that's historically accurate. Bjarki sighs dramatically. Historically accurate to who? The gods? The others laugh, but somewhere in the back of the ship, someone mutters that scholars today are still debating whether these myths were meant as literal belief, metaphor, or just really good storytelling. And honestly, after hearing Bjarki explain how a frost giant once stole the moon for interior decoration, you can see why the debate is complicated. The stories weave themselves into the air like invisible threads, tying every listener to the next, Viking and traveler alike. Storytelling is the Vikings' version of emotional infrastructure, a way to soothe fears, share identity, distract from the cold, and keep minds anchored when the world around them feels too wide. Then another voice joins in, this time a woman's, soft but clear. You turn and find Yrsa, one of the few women traveling with the crew as a healer. She holds a small pouch of herbs in one hand and stirs them absent-mindedly while speaking. Her stories are different, less about gods smashing things and more about the in-between places of the world. forests that shift shape, rivers that carry messages, stars that blink out not because they die, but because someone wishes to stay hidden. Ursa tells a tale about a fisherman who followed a glowing fish for 3 nights until it led him safely back to shore, only to vanish the moment his boat scraped onto the sand. Some claim the story came from Greenland. Others say it belongs to Norway. Scholars haven't agreed on a single origin, and probably won't for another century, because everyone wants to claim the glowing fish as their own intellectual property. You notice something subtle happening as the story deepens. The ship grows warmer. Not physically, but emotionally, like someone has draped a blanket across everyone's shoulders. These sailors, who earlier were bargaining over ceramic bowls and rolling their eyes at Snorri's theatrics, now sit completely still, leaning toward the voices floating through the dimming light. Then comes the best part, your cold, odd little fact of the day. A man named Eric, who has the posture of someone who once wrestled a sea lion and regretted it, interrupts a tale to declare that stories physically keep the ship together. When pressed to explain, he insists the wood listens, and if the wood isn't entertained, it gets bored and cracks. You try not to react, but the way he says it, stone-faced, absolutely sincere, makes you pause. Turns out, some Viking sailors really did believe that boats had personalities. Some even sang to them. Not full songs, but little murmurs. Steady, steady, calm water today. Historically speaking, it's unclear whether this belief was widespread or just the product of too many lonely nights at sea. Academics still argue over whether such murmuring counted as superstition, ship-bonding ritual, or low-key therapy. But tonight aboard this ship, it doesn't matter. The crew hums a little tune under their breath anyway, testing the superstition just in case the planks are listening. The sun finally slips beneath the horizon, leaving the sky washed with violet and deepening blue. Small lamps flicker to life, tiny circles of gold pushing back the darkness. And with the firelight glow spreading across the deck, more stories rise. Whispers about home, half-remembered tales of childhood, myths about animals that guide sailors to safety or lure them into storms. Someone asks if the spirits in the fog from earlier might be listening too. Ursa taps the side of her nose and says, "Everything listens." The question is, what does it hear? A soft quiet follows. It's not uncomfortable. It's the kind of quiet you get when everyone feels small in a good way, like being wrapped in the night instead of lost in it. You lean back against the railing. The ship sways gently. Voices drift around you like warm smoke. Somewhere behind you, someone begins carving a tiny figure out of driftwood, shaping it into a protective charm. Another sailor braids a rope pattern he learned from his grandfather. Someone else begins humming a lullaby older than any of the myths Bjarki told. And that, maybe, is the secret. Legends don't survive because people fight battles. Legends survive because people tell them in the dark on quiet nights when a ship feels like the entire world. Out on the horizon, the stars prick through the sky one by one, glittering like runes scattered across velvet. The stories continue long into the night. The morning light glances across the rippling waves, warming the deck enough to make the cold damp from last night feel like a memory rather than a burden. You stretch, yawning in sync with the crew, and notice the unmistakable aroma of breakfast drifting from the galley area, a mixture of smoked fish, coarse bread, and something you hope isn't just Viking socks reheated. You brace yourself. Honestly, if you were expecting the epic feasts of movie fame, you might be disappointed. But as always, there's more to the story than meets the nose. Breakfast is served on simple wooden boards. You grab a piece of dense bread, a few dried fish, and a cup of thin, watery ale that doubles as a drink and a mild disinfectant for whatever germs might have survived the Atlantic night. You notice the sailors are eating methodically, carefully, as if each bite has been weighed against some unwritten rule of survival. And then, just when you think it couldn't get more, Rustic, a Viking, leans over and begins bragging about last year's fishing haul. Not the size of the fish, but how he caught them. Here's your main historical fact. Vikings had a remarkably simple diet, especially on long voyages. Staples included fish, flatbread, salted meat, and occasionally dairy or berries. Their caloric intake was surprisingly high for survival, but the flavors were basic, practical rather than indulgent. Scholars still debate how often they supplemented these staples with imported goods from trading missions like honey, cheese, or even wine. As you nibble, you realize the bragging is as structured as the food. One man recounts the tale with incredible detail, how he outsmarted a particularly clever herring, the exact angle at which he struck, the heroic flailing involved. Another interrupts to claim the herring fought back, prompting an argument that's half storytelling, half comedy routine. You quietly take a bite of your bread, realizing the Vikings' storytelling talents extend beyond myths. They also narrate their own meals like mini epics. Snorri, naturally, takes the opportunity to challenge the claims. He insists he once caught an entire shoal using only his teeth and a prayer. The group laughs, shakes their heads, and debates for 5 minutes whether that counts as a skill, a miracle, or just a flat-out exaggeration. You make a mental note. Exaggeration is a cultural main course alongside fish and bread. Here's your quirky fact for the day. Vikings reportedly sometimes chewed their food as little as possible during long voyages to make it last. Yes, their survival instinct extended to rationing mastication. Scholars are still debating whether this was a practical adaptation or just a tale stretched by chroniclers with a flair for the dramatic. You chew a little more conscientiously, thinking you've just glimpsed a minor genius in survival strategy. You glance around. Everyone seems comfortable, even jovial, though you can sense the subtle hierarchy in play. The rowers sit slightly apart, shoulders tense with unspoken routines. The navigators talk quietly about currents and winds, ignoring the breakfast bickering but listening all the same. And, as you eat, you notice something oddly modern. The camaraderie at this table reminds you of family dinners, office lunches, or any situation where stories are traded alongside food, each bite punctuated by laughter or debate. Halfway through your meal, someone remarks about a neighbor's cooking skills, sparking another chain of competitive storytelling. It's less about the food itself and more about identity. The Vikings defined themselves not just by their weapons or deeds, but by their ability to tell tales, whether about hunting, fishing, or merely surviving another night at sea. At the same time, the day's work looms. After breakfast, the sailors begin cleaning gear, inspecting nets, and preparing supplies for the next leg of the journey. But you notice that even during labor, storytelling continues. Snorri hums a tune that recounts a comical mishap on the previous voyage. Others hum along, adding small sound effects or gestures, keeping the energy alive, keeping boredom and fear at bay. Even meals had rules. Everyone ate according to rank, skill, and social agreements, which were as structured as any battlefield formation. Breaking them could earn a scolding, or worse, ridicule. Social cohesion wasn't just a preference, it was survival. Scholars argue how strictly these rules were enforced and whether they evolved more from practical necessity or cultural pride. Either way, they functioned beautifully. You finish your fish, feeling strangely full, not just of food, but of stories, laughter, and a subtle lesson. For the Vikings, sustenance was as much about morale and identity as it was about calories, and perhaps that's why they were able to endure so many nights at sea, so many voyages into the unknown. Simple meals, rich stories, shared experiences. That was the real power of a Viking crew. You lean back, sipping the thin ale, watching waves glint across the horizon. Even a mundane breakfast has taught you something profound tonight. A Viking's strength isn't just in muscle or sword. It's in humor, storytelling, and the way they make ordinary meals feel heroic. The morning sun warms the deck, but the warmth doesn't reach the weight of rules that quietly guide every move on this longship. You notice it immediately. The crew doesn't just row, steer, or prepare meals randomly. Every action follows a social rhythm as strict and precise as the waves themselves. One wrong word, one skipped duty, and the ripple effect could be awkward at best. Not exactly the Hollywood chaos you might imagine from savage Vikings. You follow the sailors as they organize their gear, and it's obvious who holds authority. The captain, a tall, steady man named Leaf, walks among them, checking knots, adjusting sails, but he doesn't shout. He merely raises an eyebrow, and everyone straightens. There's no room for casual rebellion. You realize the Vikings' internal order is less about fear and more about subtle social enforcement, an intricate web of expectations, pride, and accountability. Here's your main historical point. Viking society was surprisingly structured. Family, community, and even crew hierarchy dictated behavior. There were rules for everything, from who could marry whom to how disputes were resolved, including the infamous thing, a local assembly where laws were debated, enforced, and occasionally mocked. Scholars still debate how codified these rules truly were versus being traditional customs maintained by social pressure, but either way, breaking them was rarely optional. You notice a younger sailor, Harold, hesitating before he begins cleaning a set of nets. A more experienced crew member hovers, not to scold, but to ensure it's done properly. Not harshly, just meticulously. You realize this is routine social regulation, teaching through proximity and expectation. Even in the absence of strict punishment, habits formed and responsibilities were clear. Then there's the quiet, almost invisible layer of respect. Elders are listened to, and those with experience often guide silently. A misstep might earn a look, a sigh, or a subtle comment, but the lesson is internalized. Observing you start to understand why so many historians argue about Viking social cohesion. Some insist it was rigid, almost militaristic. Others say it was flexible, community-driven. The evidence is there for both, and the debate is very much alive in academic circles. While everyone works, you overhear a conversation about honor. It's brief and almost passing, but it speaks volumes. The idea isn't about glory on the battlefield alone. It's about maintaining reputation, keeping promises, and ensuring the crew trusts each other in small, daily actions. A joke goes around about who's lazy, and even that carries social weight. Humor is both a tool and a test, keeping everyone alert while easing tension. Now here's a fun, little-known fact. Vikings sometimes used soapstone to secretly sharpen their tools while claiming to polish them. This wasn't cheating. It was clever, practical, and subtly rewarded in their social circles because efficiency and cunning counted as much as brute strength. Scholars are still debating whether this was a common tactic or just a clever anecdote passed down in sagas, but it highlights how strategy often coexisted with societal norms. You watch the crew complete their morning tasks with precision and quiet efficiency. Everyone knows their role, follows expectations, and yet there's room for individuality within those bounds. A man with a distinctive beard carves a rune on a paddle, another hums softly to himself while stacking firewood, and a woman checks the medicinal herbs they carry, ensuring nothing is spoiled. Even when disputes arise, they are managed with subtlety. Two sailors argue about the best way to stack supplies, and it's resolved not by force but by careful negotiation, a glance from an elder, and the quiet logic of shared experience. You notice that hierarchy and social rules aren't oppressive here. They're protective. They prevent chaos, ensure survival, and preserve harmony in close quarters. As you stand back and watch, you realize the quiet truth. The Vikings' internal rules are part of what made them effective, both on and off the battlefield. Discipline didn't rely solely on fear or intimidation. It relied on deeply ingrained cultural understanding, pride, and mutual respect. Their society wasn't a free-for-all, nor was it rigid tyranny. It was something subtler, smarter, and more human. And as the morning sun rises higher, warming the sails and casting playful light across the deck, you can almost hear the unspoken message of these rules. Strength lies not just in arms, but in order, trust, and knowing one's place. The sky above is a living, restless canvas today, clouds rolling in and out like mischievous spirits teasing the horizon. You glance at the water, which seems calm at first, but the waves are subtly sharper enough to make the long ship sway underfoot like a nervous horse. The Vikings aboard move with an awareness that makes your own attention sharpen. You can tell immediately that the North Atlantic doesn't negotiate politely with even the most seasoned sailor. Today, weather is the boss, and it doesn't care about legend or muscle. You see the helmsman, a wiry man named Torvald, tightening his grip on the steering oar. His knuckles blanch slightly, and you realize it's not fear of man, monster, or myth, but respect. Pure, raw respect for nature. One gust and a careless movement, and the ship could swing dangerously. One unexpected wave could send supplies tumbling into the drink. The sea commands attention, and the Vikings know it. Here's your main historical point. Viking voyages were highly dependent on seasonal weather, winds, and currents. Even the most skilled sailors often had to postpone journeys or change routes due to storms or unfavorable winds. Scholars debate the extent to which Vikings deliberately timed voyages around predictable weather patterns versus simply relying on experience and instinct. Either way, the North Atlantic was a merciless teacher. A sudden gust hits, flinging spray across the deck. A few sailors grunt, steadying ropes and masts. You notice subtle cues, the way each man communicates, sometimes with hand signals, sometimes with a single word. Coordination is essential. One mistake could lead to minor chaos, and chaos on these waters, no matter how short-lived, carries real consequences. You follow the crew as they adjust sails. Everyone moves efficiently, without panic, but the tension is palpable. You feel it too. The thrill of being small in a vast, unpredictable environment. The waves are not enemies exactly, but they are reminders of vulnerability. Even these legendary, fearless warriors can appear tense when the ocean reminds them who's really in charge. A smaller, hidden detail catches your eye: the sailor's footwear. Thick leather boots, soaked wool socks, reinforced seams. Functional, yes, but also symbolic. Every stitch, every layer, is part of their defense against the weather. The Vikings understood that survival wasn't just about fighting monsters or enemies. It was about respecting natural forces, preparing for them, and working together to endure them. Here's your unusual fact for today. Vikings sometimes used small, weighted stones to test wind and current before adjusting their sails. Not exactly modern instruments, but clever improvisation. Scholars are still debating whether these methods were universally practiced or limited to certain regions and crews, but the ingenuity speaks volumes. You watch a sailor tossing a stone over the side, adjusting a sail, and suddenly it all makes sense. Their reputation for bravery was matched by their practical problem-solving. As the day progresses, the weather becomes more unpredictable. Sunlight flickers across the waves, followed by sudden showers. You notice a man muttering under his breath, reciting a short prayer to Njord, god of the sea. Another sailor hums softly, rhythmically, almost like a lullaby meant to soothe both ship and soul. You realize that the Vikings' calm in the face of turbulent weather isn't just stoicism. It's ritual, preparation, and respect combined. Moments like these illuminate a truth historians have long debated. Were Vikings fearless warriors of legend, or careful navigators balancing courage with prudence? Observing the crew now, it's clear they were both. Bravery existed, but it was tempered by wisdom, knowledge, and an acute awareness of the real boss, the North Atlantic itself. By late afternoon, the waves have softened, and the sun pierces through gaps in the clouds. The crew exhales collectively, tension leaving their shoulders. They may have faced storms, monstrous waves, or mythical creatures on foggy nights, but today, it was the weather that ruled, and the Vikings adapted, survived, and even smiled quietly to themselves, proud of their skill and respect for the sea. You lean against the rail, letting the ship rock gently, thinking about the fine line they walked between courage and caution. Today, nature dictated terms, and the Vikings, they negotiated expertly, quietly, and wisely, proving that sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with swords, they're fought with patience, skill, and respect for the forces you cannot control. The ship hums along the water with a gentle rhythm as you notice the subtle but unmistakable presence of Viking women aboard. Not in the shadows, not as a curiosity, but as the quiet engines of this floating community. You watch as they move among the crew, checking supplies, mending sails, attending to herbs, and quietly steering social cohesion with a glance, a word, or a small gesture that carries more weight than any shouted command. Here's your main historical point. Viking women played essential roles both at home and on voyages. They were not mere bystanders. They managed farms, oversaw trade, maintained social structures, and sometimes even commanded ships or defended settlements. scholars still debate the extent to which women participated in voyages or raids, with some arguing for more active roles than sagas suggest. Either way, their influence was undeniable. You see Sigrid, a tall, steady woman with hands calloused from rope and work, adjusting a crate of trade goods. She notices a misaligned bundle of furs and silently corrects it while the men nearby continue with conversation, oblivious. Later, she kneels beside a younger girl, teaching her how to weave a knot pattern that will hold against storms. Simple actions, but each one carries the weight of survival, tradition, and knowledge transfer. The women also manage the morale of the crew. You notice how a quiet word from Yrsa or Sigrid diffuses tension after a minor argument about fish or rigging. Laughter returns faster, hands relax, and work continues with renewed focus. It's not magic, though on a long voyage, it sometimes feels like it. But social intelligence in action, a skill as critical as any sword or oar. Now for your unusual fact, some Viking women carried personal amulets or charms to protect their families during voyages. These objects could be carved stones, beads, or small weapons, and they weren't just superstitious. They were expressions of responsibility and care. Scholars continue to debate whether these were primarily symbolic or served practical purposes in daily life, but their presence in graves and archaeological finds is undeniable. Watching the women interact with the crew, you notice a rhythm. Knowledge is shared quietly, authority is asserted with tact, and safety is maintained subtly. Even in the seemingly chaotic environment of a longship, they create order and stability. One woman adjusts a sail while simultaneously keeping an eye on a small group of boys learning ropes, correcting them with gentle authority. The skill lies in multitasking seamlessly, blending education, management, and vigilance into one fluid motion. At meals, their presence is equally commanding in a soft way. They distribute food, ensure fairness, and maintain discipline without drawing attention to themselves. You realize that the Vikings' day-to-day survival, long after the battles and raids, depended more on women's organizational skills than on heroics or bravado. A brief debate arises about the best route to a nearby settlement. The men offer loud opinions. Sigrid listens quietly, then suggests a course that balances safety, distance, and wind direction. The men pause, nod, and adjust their calculations accordingly. Leadership doesn't always roar, it often whispers. Another detail emerges. Viking women sometimes oversaw the spiritual practices aboard ships, ensuring rituals were performed correctly to protect the crew from storms or misfortune. They weren't only caretakers, they were stewards of culture, tradition, and practical survival. Scholars continue to analyze graves and artifacts to fully understand the breadth of their influence, and the debate is far from settled. As the ship drifts with the tide, you lean back and watch a woman braid a young sailor's hair before he heads to the bow. She hums softly, a tune that threads through the air like an invisible net, tying together fear, courage, and routine. You realize that while history often celebrates warriors, it's these quiet figures, organizers, teachers, mediators, who make endurance and cohesion possible. The sun sinks low, casting long, warm shadows over the deck. The women continue their work with grace, unheralded, but essential. And for a moment, you understand the real power aboard a Viking ship. Not muscle or weapons, but the quiet, persistent strength of those who keep the world turning behind the scenes. The sun hangs low, painting the waves in copper and gold as the longship drifts closer to a small, rocky outpost. You notice a tension in the air that wasn't there during peaceful mornings or quiet evenings. Today, a dispute has arisen, not monstrous, not earth-shattering, but enough to catch your full attention. It's between two sailors, each insisting the other miscounted provisions during the last supply check. You can almost feel the nervous energy ripple along the deck, subtle yet palpable. You realize immediately that this is your chance to witness a Viking conflict firsthand. And no, it's not a cinematic battle with swords gleaming and dramatic slow-motion charging. The real thing is quieter, methodical, and strangely procedural. Men shift positions, eye each other, hands hover near tools, not as threats, but as measured precautions. Disagreements are handled with a mix of social pressure, skill demonstration, and controlled aggression. Here's your main historical note. Real Viking fights, whether personal disputes or battlefield encounters, were often more organized and strategic than Hollywood suggests. Sagas dramatize events, naturally, but archaeological evidence and contemporary accounts indicate that combat relied heavily on formation, coordination, and practical tactics rather than continuous, unrelenting bloodshed. Scholars still debate the extent of Viking battlefield savagery versus disciplined strategy, and the truth probably lies somewhere in between. You watch as Harold and Sigurd square off, not in open rage, but in careful demonstration. Harold shows a technique for moving a heavy barrel efficiently, insisting it's the correct method. Sigurd counters with another approach, demonstrating leverage and foot placement. The disagreement escalates into a controlled contest rather than a fight, each trying to prove competence without truly harming the other. Meanwhile, the rest of the crew watches, sometimes murmuring advice, sometimes shaking heads, sometimes silently betting which man will win the argument. The tension is almost entertaining in its subtlety, a mixture of pride, precision, and humor. You realize that for Vikings, skill often outweighed brute force. Cleverness and control could settle disputes more effectively than a drawn axe. Now for your unusual fact. Viking disputes sometimes involved formalized duels with clearly defined rules and observers, called holmgangs. These weren't simply about violence. They were regulated, legally recognized contests to prevent wider chaos. Historians debate how widespread holmgangs actually were. Some argue they were exceptional. Others believe they were a common conflict resolution method. But either way, structure governed even aggression. Back on the ship, Harold trips over a rope in his demonstration, and the tension snaps into laughter. The crew claps lightly, not in mockery, but acknowledgement. Skill can fail, pride can wobble, yet cohesion remains. The lesson isn't victory, it's respect for competence, adaptability, and mutual acknowledgement. A woman steps forward, quietly suggesting a compromise, a shared method that incorporates elements of both approaches. The men consider it, nodding slowly, and the argument dissolves into practical cooperation. You notice that humor, guidance, and mediation work far better here than dramatic aggression ever could. And here's the slightly odd, fascinating little nugget. Vikings sometimes carried miniature tools or models on board to practice techniques in case a real situation arose. It's almost like a sailor's fidget toy, but deadly practical, training fingers, reflexes, and spatial awareness without escalating risk. Scholars debate whether these were widely used or merely anecdotal. but seeing the crew handle disputes makes you think it wouldn't be surprising if miniature practice objects were standard. By evening, the disagreement is fully resolved. No one is injured, no honor is lost, and work continues with subtle acknowledgement of the day's lessons. You realize that true Viking combat, at least among the crew in these circumstances, is a blend of patience, social structure, and clever problem solving, rather than relentless ferocity. As the sun sinks below the horizon, the ship rocks gently in calm waters. You reflect on what you've observed. When Vikings did fight, whether against men or nature, it was often measured, strategic, and informed by social cohesion. Legends may exaggerate heroics, but real strength lies in skill, respect, and knowing when to apply force and when to negotiate. Watching the sunset, you realize that even conflict on a Viking ship can teach a quiet kind of awe, a reminder that discipline, wit, and subtlety can be as formidable as any blade. The last light of day drifts across the waves, turning the ocean into a mirror of molten gold and fading violet. You lean against the railing, letting the gentle sway of the longship lull your body into a slower rhythm, almost like the heartbeat of the sea itself. The crew moves around you quietly, finishing chores, sharing small gestures, and occasionally letting a soft laugh escape into the evening air. Tonight, there's no battle, no storm, no fog, just the calm hum of the Atlantic and the subtle weight of reflection. Over the course of this journey, you've seen the Vikings in all their complexity. You've witnessed their fear of the dark, the way fire was hoarded like treasure, the fog that made them pause, the eerie songs of hidden spirits that drifted over the water. You've walked through their daily routines, shared in their meals, listened to their stories, and watched as women quietly held their society together. You've seen arguments settle without swords drawn, witnessed negotiation and trade take precedence over raids, and understood that much of their legendary fierceness is tempered by careful thought, community, and respect for the forces around them. History paints them as larger-than-life warriors, often emphasizing myth over reality. But now, having traveled alongside them, you begin to see the truth. The Vikings were human first, brave, clever, social, fearful at times, resourceful, and endlessly adaptive. They were people who struggled with uncertainty, who sought security in rituals, storytelling, and community. Their legends endure, yes, but the real story is quieter, softer, and profoundly relatable. You watch as the stars prick through the darkening sky, small points of light glimmering like distant lanterns guiding the way. Somewhere nearby, a sailor hums a faint tune that threads through the ship, pulling everyone gently toward the rhythm of night. The stories, the songs, the careful observances, they continue to hold the world together, even as the sea stretches endlessly around you. You realize that this is the essence of their enduring presence, not merely in raids or battles, but in the simple acts of living, caring, and connecting under the vast, uncertain sky. A gentle wind brushes your face. The waves lap softly against the hull. You notice the faint scent of the ocean mixed with smoke and wet wool, a reminder that life is both messy and beautiful, and that endurance is a quiet kind of heroism. The Vikings, in all their human nuance, have taught you something subtle but profound, that courage is as much about understanding your limits as pushing them, that community is a shield stronger than any weapon, and that stories can be the brightest light on the darkest night. You settle into your spot, listening to the soft murmurs, the creak of the ship, the gentle sigh of the sea. Your eyelids grow heavy, the rhythm of the waves and the hushed voices blending into a lullaby. The ocean is vast, the stars are steady, and the lessons of the day sink in slowly, letting the mind drift with them. Tonight, the Vikings aren't legends or myths. They are companions on this quiet journey, ordinary humans navigating the extraordinary world around them. Now, as your body relaxes and the gentle rocking carries you closer to sleep, you feel the edges of the day softening. The world, the sea, the people you've traveled with, and even the fears they once held, all of it blends into a comforting hum. And in this moment, you understand something essential: that bravery, wisdom, and compassion often exist not in dramatic gestures, but in simple, persistent acts of living well together. Tonight, let the world be a little gentler, and may your dreams be long and sweet. Good night.